Welcome back to the Direct Instruction Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Zach Groshell. If you're new here, this show is about Big DI, direct instruction as a science of teaching. We look at real implementation, talk with people running DI in schools around the world, and get practical about delivering faultlessly designed curriculum programs. If this is your first time tuning in, take a look through the back catalog. There's a growing library of conversations with DI implementers, trainers, and practitioners. Now, I've just returned from the National Direct Instruction Conference and Institutes in Eugene, Oregon. Packed sessions, amazing block parties, and the kind of hallway conversations that stay with you. I filmed a few mini YouTube reflections and quick interviews at the conference, and those links are in the show notes. If you're implementing DI or thinking about getting started, I strongly recommend reaching out to NIFTI, the National Institute for Direct Instruction, at www.nifty.org. They are the gold standard for DI coaching, training, and ongoing implementation support. With the momentum still fresh from Eugene, today we launch a special two-part international episode with two guests doing serious direct instruction work across the globe. First up is Jessica Colleu Terradas joining us from Australia. She supports DI at a system level, and she's been leading spelling mastery and other literacy work using direct instruction programs. She's deeply involved in helping schools build teacher precision and DI fidelity in real classrooms. Then we'll hear from Jon Owen in the UK, who leads corrective mathematics groups and works with schools to bring DI interventions to students. He's part of a growing movement in the UK to deliver high-fidelity math instruction to learners who've been underserved by traditional approaches, and we get into what the rollout of DI looks like in a UK context. It's a sharp look at how Engelmann's design travels, adapts, and stays rooted in student outcomes across very different systems. Let's get into all of this and more with Jessica and Jon. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. I am here with Jessica Colleu Terradas, and we're going to be talking all about DI in Australia to start off this international episode on direct instruction. I'm very, very excited. How are you doing today, Jessica?
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me with you guys.
We're going to start with Australia because you know this context very well. I know you have an accent, and I'm just curious where you're from and what's your sort of backstory.
I was born and bred in France and spent about 20 years of my life in France, growing up in Paris. And then I moved to Australia as a backpacker back in the early 2000s. Never intended to stay in Australia, but here I am. It's been over 15 years now that I've been living in Australia and working here. And I guess my background is in anthropology initially, where I did my studies in France. I did a Master of Research around Aboriginal culture. So that's what made me actually come to Australia the first time. I lived in the outback in an Indigenous community. And then after that, that's where I saw the disadvantage faced by those populations and decided that I thought education is going to be the best way to help those kids catch up and succeed. So that really ignited my passion for education at that point in time. And therefore, I studied a master I did my teaching degree initially back in WA in Western Australia. And then after that, I launched into a master in special education under the supervision of Dr. Lauren Hammond, professor now. And then from there, I got my first gig in a high school setting with high school kids who were struggling with reading, coming into year 7 with very poor literacy skills. And I set up an intervention program with my former principal at the time, who was really fond of DI because he's used to programs in Tom Price up north in Indigenous community in Western Australia. And so we started that intervention gathering for about 50 kids a year between year 7 to year 10 and targeting literacy such as spelling, and then reading was a big one. And then we did maths as well using some of those DI programs. And then after that, I moved on to South Australia to work with the Department of Education as a literacy coach, and then moved across another state a couple of years after that to work in SCT, and I'm still working there, I guess, working for the Catholic Education of Canberra and Goulburn, overseeing 56 schools across 2 jurisdictions. So SCT, Australian Capital Territory, and then New South Wales, And then as of last year, I've just started jumping into another state, New South Wales, where I'm currently based, still working part-time in Canberra, but studying full-time my PhD under the supervision of Professor Anne Castles and Ronald Parilla and Dr. Daniel Colleu, looking at how we can help those high school kids get better. And so I'm looking at spelling and morphology in year 7 at the moment.
Wow, so you've been everywhere and you've done a lot of stuff. And you mentioned that
Yes.
you got into DI because, well, I know Lorraine Hammond has connections there, but also you had
Mm-hmm.
the principal who was big on it. The programs are not universally received well across the English speaking world, but I'm curious, like not having that much experience and exposure to the Australian education system, how are programs in general, and specifically, how are structured programs like DI received in Australia?
Yes, that's very true. It's not always well perceived. I guess I speak of my experience. I can't speak on behalf of the whole of Australia. Just want to make that clear. But one of the, I guess, resistance, I'd say, to DI programs is because of that perceived rigidity. Teachers might often say that they feel constrained or that the script takes away their creativity. But I would argue that actually by having that prepped and organized and highly scaffolded for you would give you more time or free up time in your prep time to focus on your delivery and therefore respond better or respond to the needs of the student at the point in time. So yes, perceived rigidity, some of the challenges is about resistance to change, I'd say, more than anything, having to implement something that's different to what you used to teach or the way you used to teach might be very challenging. And I think some of the resistance or some of the perceived challenges could be attached or correlated to misconception about DI philosophy and not understanding what are the principles underpinning DI, which are, DI programs have a strong track records of proven results. So not knowing about, how they're built, why they're built this way, that they're aligned with, cognitive sciences, about how small materials is reviewed over time and how it's broken down into smaller chunks so it doesn't cognitively overload the students and so on. There's so much to learn about DI to reduce those fears. And in terms of challenges, I'd say, yeah, mostly the script, the way you have to deliver the program, the time that comes with it, whether you deliver it as intended. Yeah, change is just something that people fear in general. So yeah,
But just that it takes a certain commitment to
yeah.
teaching to mastery, to getting kids in homogeneous groups, to looking at data,
Mm,
to actually adjusting the groups. And it takes a committed and sort of comprehensive systematic approach to how education works, that it's so much easier to kind of be loose and let kids just kind of move on every time the lesson's over, and so I see that there too. You mentioned spelling. I just started spelling mastery with my
oh,
daughter,
great.
right?
You'll be a very good speller in no time.
So do you know a lot about spelling mastery?
Yeah, I taught it for 8 years. Yes, I've taught spelling mastery for 8 years in high school. So again, with those at-risk adolescents who were very weak, or like some operating at a year 2 reading level. So I've used them, yeah, delivered myself across all the levels, the 6 levels that are out there, knowing that level A is your lowest level. And then we've also, in my system, in the Catholic Education of Canberra and Goulburn, we've got 48 primary schools and about up to date, I think 47 of our primary schools are currently using spelling mastery between year 3 through to year 6. So we've had that implemented and staggered, I guess, over time, but fully implemented, I think, over the last 2, 3 years now. So I'm currently actually going out to schools, coaching teachers and leaders, and kind of, like you mentioned, instructional grouping is a big one in terms of logistic, time, resources allocation, all this are factors to take into account if you want to have a very high success of implementation and success in, that results into students' performance. Yeah.
So tell me what you need to know to, because you are very much now an expert in implementing spelling mastery,
Not
right? You've
you.
just what do you need to know? And because I have been recommending it to schools specifically, they suggest that the kids won't write, the kids can't produce
Yeah.
writing. They often don't write by hand very frequently. Also, the kids were not taught to mastery when it came to their phonics, and so they're sort of a little older, and spelling mastery kind of can be one of those interventions that's used or as part of the core literacy block that builds up skills that maybe the teacher doesn't have in their toolkit. I'm curious. So, what do you kind of have to go through to roll it out and implement spelling mastery?
Well, that's a big one. The first one will be to do the placement test. So each of the DI program, it's a no-brainer. You need to know where the kids are at, and especially because you teach to mastery, so you can't teach too far off the mark where the kids are currently are at their level. Otherwise, you will never reach mastery. So being able to, yeah, administer the placement test, which for spelling mastery, for instance, is about, I think, 5 lists of 10 words. And so you just administer that as a group administration. So time efficiency ticked, that's the box ticked. And then if the kids, I think for memory, if the kids made five more errors on each list of 10 words, then they sit into that level. So knowing that level A is your lowest, and I think EFF would be the highest. That's probably the first thing, placement test. Then after that, once you've got the placement test, you would actually start grouping students accordingly. So you would have instructional grouping, what's called in DI, where you would place the students according to where their skill set is at. Then that's probably one of the challenges as well at a high school, for a leader to organize the staffing that goes with it, because having multiple instructional groupings means you need to have a staff member to deliver each of the groupings. So that could be a very tricky one. Our schools are struggling with this in terms of logistics. Think about having your more advanced teachers or your more skilled teachers with the most challenging classes. Often they end up being the lowest students, the lowest groups, so the low ability kids who sit at the level A or B. Then after that, so we'd have to provide training, definitely, to your staff. That's a no-brainer, but not just training before, but also throughout the implementation. Often I feel that just gets left out. You get the bulk, like in any kind of new thing. You go to your PR, you get your first bulk of theory and practice and a bit of practice with the script. And then after that, it just fades out and you've got no support in the classroom as you're going through the pitfalls, of implementation. So very important that you provide the upfront training that goes with, having the teachers to practice the script, because it's often very new. Practice the signals that goes with DI. How do you correct errors in the classroom on the spot? And then also provide in-class coachings as a follow-up. Fourth point I'd say will be about monitoring the instruction, monitoring student performance. How is that happening? How is it going? So for that, you need to go in and observe teachers. All teachers collect their own progress monitoring data that is built into the program. Every 5 or 10 lessons, no, I've got a blank, that you have a mastery test. And therefore, teachers collect this data on a regular basis and make sure that they need to act upon it and apply what we call remedies. So whether a kid is not mastering the 80% benchmark as mastery, then you would have to apply remedies or reteach part of a lesson if the kids haven't mastered that. As a leader, you will go in and observe and collect your own data. So it could be that you just tally mark how often the kids respond, how often you might even tally mark, I don't know, I'm thinking the teacher-student ratio. You might just time this in a classroom and looked at identifying what's the learning problem. So where are the challenges there? Is that because the students is not getting it right, after 3 practices, or is that because the teachers is not delivering the script as intended and skipping parts? So there's lots of things you could be looking at as you observe. So often I think of it as 2 parts, looking at presentation skills from the teacher whether they follow the script, for instance, and then correction skills. I think those are the most important, knowing how the teachers correct students' mistakes or misconception on the spot, how they deal with it. So whether they actually, like explicit instruction is really, I'll give you the answer. I made it very crystal clear. I'm not going to ask you to guess forever. If you got it wrong the first time, I'm going to give you the answer. Then I'm going to model. So I'm going to redo that part. And then I'm going to go back to the start of that exercise to delay the testing. So whether I know after going back through all these examples, then whether you can still do it or not.
Those
And
error corrections, they're not well understood. Of course, they're described at the beginning of every DI program, but you
they
know
have,
how easy it is to skip through the beginning of the thing, right? And just start. So you get the script and it says there's just several little things it would say. It would say repeat until firm. Oh, I skipped that. I don't know
yes,
what that means. Or it says individual turns. I don't know what individual turns means. I skipped that part, right? Or it says do all of these words like mat, but do it for cat, rat, sat, and hat. And then you have to do
on the script,
8 more,
yeah.
right? You skip that, right? And by that time, yeah, that's why your lesson only lasted 12 minutes. But you need to go back to the beginning of the part. You need to give the delayed test. You need to give lots of
Mm-hmm.
that positive feedback. And you need to not skip the individual turns and the extra practice words. It's so important to know all these things, like you said.
Are you doing with your daughter? Do you go back and practice those error correction procedures? Yeah.
Well, absolutely. The funny thing about one-on-one, it's the same with like teacher child to read,
Yeah.
is that it can be a little more dialogic. It doesn't have to be like get ready.
Yeah.
You can be like, all right, let's go, and you can be a little bit more back and forth, but the principles stay the same. If she gets it wrong, you got to correct her immediately. Listen, 3 plus 3 is 6. What is 3 plus 3? 6. Great. Let's start at the beginning. I'm going to give you a delayed test, right? I
Exactly.
still do the same thing.
And I agree, it's a lot less rigid when you're one to one because it's not the same dynamic. Obviously, you need to be a lot more firm when you deliver to a group because you've got that chorus response. So you want to account for everyone, and at the same time, you don't want anyone that just answer on the signal before or after. So you don't have the lead students. You want everyone to respond at the same time, so you can hear whether there's any mistakes happening at the same time and just troubleshoot, like you said, repeat again, practice again, go back to the part and repeat the exercise to delay the testing.
If there's parents listening or someone doing it one-on-one, I would still suggest don't freelance at all while you're doing it. Just do it
No.
exactly as intended. But things that are built into the script, like touch part A. But I don't need to say touch part A because we're sitting right next to each other. We're both already pointing at it. There's just little nuances there, but for the most part, just doing it as it says, works just fine. I'm curious about with your experience with direct instruction, are there any like success stories or changes you've observed in schools that have adopted these programs and actually really implemented them with fidelity?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start with my personal example, professional example. When I delivered DI for adolescent at risk, I was able to provide that kind of instruction that they needed, that highly structured, explicit instruction, where really helping them to catch up with their peers. So I had kids who, despite being 5, 6 years behind in their schooling, were able to almost catch up to their peers at grade level. Obviously, they're older, so the rate of progress is going to be slower, and there's a lot of other layers like self-esteem, motivation that could impair the learning or the growth or even the speed of at which they learn and remedy some of the gaps. In terms of success, yes, that was some of them. One of my biggest success, I'd say, out of these cohorts of students that went through it, that two of them, I guess one of them, my biggest success was the one kid who actually ended up going to university. So that was a massive plus for me. Like that was such a rewarding outcomes because that kid I knew would have a successful life with choices to make rather than being set to one trajectory. In terms of other schools, I've got one high school. I've got a couple of high school in my system using corrective reading for intervention. And one of them actually, I've wrote it down because I thought maybe that question might pop in. one of our schools, so it's a girls' school, and they apply corrective reading, decoding, and comprehension and spelling mastery, so a blend. And they catering for about 50 female students in their school across year 7 to year 8. And so as of last year, so I was telling the literacy coordinator, try to get some standardized assessment on top of some of the built-in monitoring tools in spelling mastery, for instance, so then you can have a more objective approach to how the kids is traveling. And then so she administered the York assessment. It stands for York Assessment of Reading Comprehension. And it assesses a range of underlying, literacy-related skills like word knowledge, word level, decoding, vocab knowledge, reading comprehension, and so on. And out of those 50 kids, on average, some of this, actually, I've got the exact number here. 13 of those students have made, on average, a year and 5 months growth in 1 year of instructional input. And others have made over a year growth on vocab, on reading comprehension, and reading at word level. So that was massive report or guess success for her, and that was part of her reporting to parents, the end of year report that she sent out to parents. And then she was very excited to give me, to tell me the news about it. And then another example I could think of was more at a whole school level, so not just for intervention purposes, but in Cape York, in the far north of Queensland, in Australia, you've got schools there that are so very remote Indigenous communities, and one of those organizations was Good to Great School, that was initially founded by Noah Pearson, a very prominent Indigenous Australian lawyer and strong advocate for DI. He implemented those programs in those schools, and he demonstrated or showed. There was an article he wrote, actually. I'm not sure if he wrote it, maybe others, but it was released in 2021. It's called Yes, DI Did It. And so he reports as well the success of DI. And in one of the points that he made, he said that schools showed significant growth in reading. For example, schools involved in 2 years of program receiving DI had made, on average, 124% of growth. So, and he used he used the NAPLAN reading scores as well, which is our national reading assessment across Australia. So he compares the scores of those schools who received DI and those other schools who did not receive DI, and to actually show the correlation between the implementation of the DI program and some of the performance of students versus other schools who did not use DI. So yeah, big success. Like clearly, there's no can't doubt. Those are data. They're there.
That's excellent. And I know just a little bit about the Australian context from talking to friends like Nathaniel Swain and Brendan
Yes.
Lee. These are my buds. But like it seems like Australia is just tiptoeing closer to perhaps the leadership that the UK was giving around the science of learning and explicit instruction. Are there are there sort of things that are coming into laws and policy and into policy documents that are sort of emerging that are suggesting a growing interest in explicit forms of teaching in general, which obviously DI very heavily supports?
I'm not sure. Yes, I'm very happy that it's being pushed through in policies, and various departments of education have launched, their approach to teaching as explicit instruction, putting a bit of a brand on it. For me, it's more about when and how. Like explicit instruction, yes, is so beneficial for kids who are starting, learning new skills, for instance. So there's that, that continuum of instruction. I like to put it that way, where you've got a highly scaffolded explicit approach for novice learners, and then as they get better and accumulate knowledge, then they can draw on that knowledge to build bigger or more knowledge, and then therefore you could delay the feedback, and then you could do, you could tend to a more inquiry-based learning as they become expert in their domain. I think, yes, we've got the right push in there. I'm not sure yet whether it translates into practice in the classroom yet, and I hear, teacher might say, oh, I already do explicit instruction. This is what I do every day, but I'm not sure it translates, with high fidelity in some cases where maybe, what you think is explicit instruction, you might not quite fully yet grasp all the concept that goes with it. the scaffold, the scope and sequence, just thinking about how often you retrieve and distribute the reviews. I think that's very important and not always well set up in curriculum documents, for instance. So yeah, watch this space. I think like we've got, the right intention, we've got the right approach. Then it's whether it translate, then to a classroom level. I'm really keen. I can't visit every classrooms in Australia, so it's really hard to tell. I can speak of my system, and we have made really good inroads. Like we've our results in NAPLANs have gone up since we shifted to structured literacy and high impact teaching practices based on the science of learning. So we're getting there. It's just it takes time. Takes time.
It's interesting because it goes back to this kind of discussion we've had over all these podcast episodes where uh like let's say that everybody does learn about cognitive load theory and they do learn
Hmm.
about interleaving and space practice and these are just sort of in the shared language of educators. That's awesome, right? We have to do this. So you understand why and you understand what to do, but then there it comes this barrier in which are we having all teachers design their own instruction from scratch, and can they do that as well as field
Mm.
tested materials by people that their entire job is to design instruction based on these principles? And I understand there's two points of view here. For me, I see the DI side as being a much stronger argument. I'm curious if
Hmm.
that's if you think so as well.
Yeah, I mean, it does have to be like use DI if you think that would fit your context as well. So what's the population you teaching as well, whether and you'd have to think about the resources allocation. That's a big one. You'd have to buy materials. You'd have to, like I said earlier, you'd have to have instructional grouping according to level skills levels. So therefore, you might need more staff to teach. And do you have that? I mean, we know we're going through a shortage of teachers across, the world pretty much. So can you afford to deliver DI as intended? Like, because there's it's yeah, I'm torn because if you can't deliver it as intended, there's almost no point to it because then you're not gonna get the best out of the program. If you deliver DI only twice a week for 20 minutes, if let's say it's corrective reading, well, you might as well do nothing
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah,
something else. Sorry,
yeah.
but
Because they'll just
so
have they'll just have forgotten it, or they'll just not have they'll not be able to learn that next small 10% step that's been added on to their
mm,
repertoires because there's too much there's too little of a dosage, and you don't train the folks. And would it be better to maybe rethink this for next year? Let's reallocate some resources and do this properly is probably the best way. I have one more question for you
can
before you. Yeah, go ahead,
Uh,
go ahead, go ahead, go
and
ahead.
can I add one point just because I was thinking DI is also excellent if you know nothing about, let's say, explicit instruction. I felt like I've learned so much by delivering the program. I learned about the content, like let's say, how to teach spelling with spelling mastery. I had never taught spelling before, and especially not in high school. So that program gave me excellent tools and a very full teacher kit, I guess, where I had really highly effective teaching techniques to apply. And then I had the right content and the script was field tested. So I was like, okay, well, while I was still learning about how I delivered and how I teach spelling at the time, I knew that the content was hitting the mark because it was field tested and, I wasn't doing any harm to the kids while I was still clunky in my delivery. So I guess it's a good way to also upskill yourself faster
Yeah.
if you're new to that area. For instance, I think DI is formative assessment on steroid. Like, the amount of time that you check in for understanding, making sure kids reach mastery, there's no misconception carried on. Like that's such a very important skill for a teacher to be that responsive and have that high interaction between student and teachers.
Absolutely. I've just been thinking about that because when you're a new teacher and you're just coming into the system and you don't
Mm.
really know what it's like to check that often. You don't really know what it's like to teach at a brisk pace. You don't really know what
Yes.
it's like to give this amount of practice. It's ridiculous the amount of practice you're going to get in a DI program compared to just a couple of hands up you would get in a conventional classroom. So this
Yeah.
it can teach you what great teaching looks like while doing it. Is
Yes.
something, at least that's my hypothesis. I don't, I don't have like empirical
Because
data for it.
yeah.
I do have one more question for you before we're going, and that's that I hear you went to Nifty's conference in Eugene. I haven't
Yeah.
been, and
Okay.
I'm really looking forward to this summer. I'm curious, what do I have to look forward to?
Oh, just being surrounded by like-minded people and very strong advocate, passionate educators. I had a great time there. That was my first time as well. I think it was 2 years ago, and I did the one of the training for becoming an effective DI trainer. So you've got different institutes. So you've got the conference, and then on the side you've got different institutes where you can become a DI trainer, coach implementation, and so on. So they've got a full suite of offering there. It was really interesting for me to sit in a DI trainer class delivering corrective reading decoding because when I learned about corrective reading when I was back, what, 15 years ago, I didn't have that training. I pretty much picked up the book, looked at what's online, had my principal to coach me, visit my classes, tell me off if I wasn't using my signal, and so on. I wish I had gone there to do it. But over there, it's like the next level up. The rigor and the fidelity they apply to their training is, yeah, next level up. Like they say, corrective reading, you might take like a whole week to get the full training set. For spelling mastery, like you might take, I think they said 12 hours of training to be able to implement it. However, the reality is, and you would know so well, when you're in a school or in education setting, you might only be given 2 hour staff meeting at a pupil-free day.
Yeah.
And then teachers have to go off and implement it the next day. So um, there's a bit of a gap there. I guess you kind of adjust because that's where we know we just adjust on the fly, really, but making sure that you follow up with coaching in class, for instance. Other things to look forward to is, I guess, yeah, some of those keynotes and really mixing up and networking with teachers that are attending, but also the expert there. There's such a huge amount of knowledge out there. You must, yeah, you'll enjoy it. And Eugene is very nice as well. There's some good places to go and eat. Yeah.
That's awesome. I hope people, if you're listening, come to my thing. But it's kind of like there's so many great names and great presenters there. It'd be like turning down a $200 like dry age steak for like four chicken McNuggets if you came to my institute. But I will give you my best talking about science of learning as it applies to DI. Jessica, it is so great to finally connect with you. We are now going to turn over to Jon Owen, who's going to be talking to us all about DI in the UK as part of this fantastic international DI episode. Listeners, let's go on over to the other side and across the pond and meet with Jon Owen. All right, I'm here now with Jon Owen. Jon, how are you doing?
Hi, Zach. I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me today.
And where are you in this international episode? Where are you calling in from?
I'm from the UK. I've got the special accent. I had it all my life. Sunny UK. The sun's now come out. It's now decided to be spring here in the UK.
I love it. And I came into contact with you through some of our online debates and struggles with our advocacy for direct instruction. I'm curious, can you maybe tell us like how you got into DI, like and how how you currently use it?
Well, when I first started teaching, I realized I was teaching maths, teaching non-DI to begin with, and I realized that students in the lower performance half of each year in school, teaching secondary age students, were not learning as successfully as they could be. And I went out and searched for various different curricula, and I tried them all out in the classroom. And it was only when I came across DI that I found something that was really effective for all of the students. And I moved from where I used to live in the southeast a couple of times actually in order to teach DI. And I eventually put myself in a position where I could teach it full time. I was really lucky. That's how I got into DI. And nowadays I teach the corrective maths program, which I believe that you've taught before, and we've seen tremendous student success with it. So it's been absolutely great. So it comes from a position of seeing students struggle in the classroom, struggling to learn, and that being really quite a systemic problem that we have, and taking the steps needed to fix it. Yeah, it's been a really exciting and really rewarding journey.
That's awesome. And when I was talking to Jessica just earlier in this episode, we talked a lot about the Australian context and kind of the movement towards the broader ideas of the science of learning. And I'm just curious, like knowing what you might know about the American context, like are things getting better? Are they, in your view, are they improving in the UK? Like have some of these reforms that have come out, how have they impacted you and in schools?
Things are changing, and in the UK, things have been changing for the last 10 years. They are mostly on the level of delivery. People are more interested in delivery than they are in curriculum. There are some people who talk about curriculum and advocate for curriculum and design, but the science behind how students learn and how students can be successful is very much centered around the delivery in the UK rather than the design. And that's the major place where we could improve. If you were talking to someone in the UK, someone who thought that they were pretty well versed in teaching and learning and who are interested in those things, they would be talking about a delivery, how to have good pace, how to make every second count of your lesson, bell to bell teaching, a high rate of responding, feedback, all of those elements. They wouldn't be talking about, or they wouldn't be so much talking about how much practice do children get? How do you teach in a way that you don't confuse? How can you be clear with your instruction? How can you make sure that your instruction is actually tailored to the level of performance that the children are at? How do you structure the lesson so that groups are homogeneous in their performance? How do you do assessment? All of these things are deprioritized, and I think that's because we know less about them. But unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, because it could be quite exciting, those underlying design elements are precursors to those delivery elements being really successful. So if we can get ourselves to a position where we're teaching a really well-designed curriculum, we can then leverage all of those delivery techniques, which are completely valid.
And for what I understand, like talking to a lot of my UK friends, is that programs are sort of frowned upon in many schools. And many people that I really respect will say that you can start from scratch and develop an entire reading program just by lots of meetings, PLCs. I suppose someone maybe is in charge of managing this. I don't know. And it just they're so confident that that can happen and that programs should not have anything to do with this. There's sort of no starting point. Has that been your experience as well?
Yes. In the UK, we don't, although that is changing as well, we don't so much have a paradigm of you implement a program. That kind of mental model or idea isn't a thing in the UK as much. That's changing. 20 years ago, we had a report into reading. Around the time of Reading First, we had our own report into reading. And somewhat unusually, in the world of politics, the report's recommendations were taken seriously and they were carried over between governments. And so in the primary sector, we do have an idea of implementing programs. You take a prepackaged program and you implement it for reading. It would be unusual, I think, in the UK in primary to find a school that is not teaching a reading program of some sort. But when you get into the murky weeds of what you said there, which is that some people think that you can design your own program for reading and maths and so on, it's the sort of thing that, yes, you can. You can do that. But then the question is, what do you mean by success? So, of course, anyone can design their own curriculum and they can implement their own curriculum, or some version of that where every day they give a different worksheet and they find something online and they put something together. A lot of teachers operate on this basis because they don't really have another choice. But then the question is, what is success? And if success is like, half of the children in the room are learning, well, then it's abundantly possible to have a somewhat unstructured approach. The closer and closer and closer and closer you get to the idea that actually 100% of the students in the room need to be successful, the more you will not be able to have that happen by designing things yourself. Unless, of course, your class is a room full of high performers, in which case the trickiest part of the job was done when they were small children, and then they can be very successful later on. So it is abundantly possible to design your own sequence, but we need to be very careful, because here's a kind of statistical thing where you can turn the tables, where you can say 70% of the students in my room are learning, and that's great. And then the next year, 70% are learning, and then the next year, the 70% are learning. But the problem with that is that the 30% aren't changing. So the 30% of kids are the same kids. So those 30% aren't learning so well in the first year, and then the same kids aren't learning as well in the next year, and then the same kids aren't learning as well in the next year, and then those kids get further and further and further and further behind. And so when you scale that up, you end up with a situation where there's this cohort of children who are very far behind.
You're sort of alluding to a few things, like it's resistance to placement testing, sort of. It's also in homogeneous grouping, but also if everybody's designing their own thing, they're really designing it for, like you said, the 70% of kids who are going to respond to it. What about the rest of the kids? Suppose we just sort of drag them along, and at some point in time, their behaviors start to be expressed maybe in a negative way, or the child has to then receive a lot of remediation, and now their self-concept that was originally trying to be protected is now ruined or destroyed in some way. And I just think with your program with corrective math, how is it set up? How do the students come in? Like, how are they sort of organized? How do they work with you? Because you said you do this all the time. This is your full-time job, is working with these kids.
What I used to do is I used to placement test all of the students who come in at the age of 11, and that's a lot of work, especially when you've got cohort sizes of like 250. That's a lot of tests to mark. So now what we do is we take the standardized testing data that comes from the primary schools, and then we filter out the bottom 40%. And you can do roughly the same thing with reading as well. You have an initial data filter, and then that bottom part you then test for who's going to go where. Now, one of the things that we found is you have two options when you're doing corrective maths in terms of placement testing. You have the comprehensive placement test, which will test addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, basic fractions and fractions, decimals and percentages, which are all the different modules, like the little levels of corrective maths. That will test them all in one test. And what we found was that it wasn't valid enough. And instead now what we use is not the comprehensive test, we use the module-specific placement test. So we will test that bottom 40% for addition and subtraction only. We'll figure out who those kids are. We'll then give a numeracy age test to give a second data source, and then we'll carefully filter out the lowest performers, and then we'll group them, and we'll give them addition, of course, because we prioritize the lowest performers. And then you have yourself a couple of addition groups, and then we group them. Group sizes should be no more than 15. And it's very important with corrected maths that the group size is no more than 15. Now, that's very difficult to do in the UK system usually, because with small group sizes, that you need a lot of capacity to be able to deal with that. So you have your placement test, you have your groups, you buy your materials, and then you organize training. And the training aspect of it is very important. High fidelity training in the delivery of the programs, which is overwhelmingly practice rather than theory. That's the progress of setting students up for success in corrected maths. It's also important students have a timetable or a schedule which allows for at least 4 hours a week of instruction. The timetable needs to have the right number of minutes, or the program won't be successful. So all these elements lead to a setup for success.
One thing I always get a question about when it comes to this kind of program is that a lot of schools really want the students to go ahead and do fractions and decimals. They want them to just go to the level that perhaps that's their area of struggle in their core math classroom. And they don't they don't think it's a good bang for their buck to go back into master prerequisites. What are your thoughts on that perspective?
You need to teach the students from the first point at which they start making a reasonable number of mistakes. So you want to start teaching the students at the point where they are 70% first time correct. So if on a test they would get 7 out of 10, they're probably placed appropriately. What we will find in a normal school in the UK is 80%-ish of students will place into one of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, because the multiplication and division contains long multiplication column problems and long division column problems, and students tend to struggle with those. That tends to be something that has slipped them or eluded them. So because let's think about the reasoning behind that, or the logic behind that. Most of maths is dependent on arithmetic. So if you're going to be teaching students about fractions, as soon as you start teaching more than one thing at a time, when we talked about the percentage, trying to get 100% of students, as soon as you start teaching more than one thing at a time, you start to lose that 100%. That percentage figure goes down and down and down as soon as you start teaching too much, because you lose kids at that point. If you think about trying to learn fractions, okay, how much are students trying to learn at one time? If they're trying to add fractions with unlike denominators, they have the arithmetic skills of doing that, but then they have the procedural or mechanical manipulations required that are specific only to adding fractions. So if you're trying to teach students so that 100% of them are going to learn the material, they need to have mastered the arithmetic, or they need to at least be pretty firm on the arithmetic before you then try to teach the procedural details of adding the fractions or whatever else it is you're trying to do. Having said that, you always have to think about time. Students only have a certain fixed amount of time, and when you go from the fractions all the way back to the addition, that's going to take those arithmetic skills is going to take a couple of years to teach. And so there's always a balance between the mastery and progress. You want students to be at mastery, but also you're going to have to move really quickly, because you need students to get the content that they would otherwise be missing.
And when you're teaching these programs, like one of the comments we get a lot of times online is just like, how can you stay fulfilled and enjoying your job when you have to start at the first page of corrected math addition dozens and dozens of times?
It can be tricky sometimes. It's not all rosy and sunny. There will be times where you do have that self-doubt, where you think, why am I teaching addition for lesson number 57 right? Of teaching addition, when normally in teaching everything is kind of arranged against that idea, where you sample one topic and then quickly move to another topic and then quickly sample another topic and so on and so on and so on, especially at the secondary level. The way you do it is you shift your perspective. This is very difficult to do because usually when you start out as a teacher, you are taught or you assimilate the idea that teaching is creative and that it is in some way teacher centered. So I am going to deliver inspiring lessons that's going to be an extension of my personality and I'm going to be creative. Now, it's not that we want to stamp out those things necessarily, but we need to have a tweak in our perspective or a complete shift in our perspective from the teacher onto the students. Because otherwise, with a teacher-centered approach, you risk the teacher having a rip-roaring time, but the students being unsuccessful. Or at least the teacher centering what success means in terms of moving through the curriculum. If you center things on the students, then you realize, actually, yeah, we're doing all of these addition lessons, but many of the kids are still making mistakes. They're still doing reversals when they're doing the carrying in the column problem, and they're forgetting some of their facts. So actually, these lessons are needed. And if you have that perspective, a kind of student perspective, and you have the knowledge that they placed into the program anyway, so that helps. If you have that student perspective, it changes the mental kind of opinion or feel of it to, yeah, it might be kind of mechanical and kind of repetitive, but they are becoming really successful. And this is the hardest group of children to teach, the kids who are really down and out and the kids who need us more than anyone else. And they are successful. And so that becomes the thrill rather than it being an extension of my own creativity or a love of subject. You know, I'm teaching calculus and it's really interesting and I can profess about it. It's just a bit of a change in mindset.
You know, and I've heard folks from your side of the pond like would say like, yeah, why don't I just have a computer teach them at some point? Like, why don't I just have a robot do it? Or like they'll really denigrate the idea of programs as teacher proofing, I suppose, because they will have lost something by not being able to plan their lessons, they say. Are you enjoying yourself? I mean, are you enjoying teaching, with these programs in hand?
It's not the kind of joy which is I'm on a roller coaster or I'm at a party or I'm having a great time. It's the deep satisfaction that a surgeon might have, where a surgeon does the same surgery every day and it's kind of mechanical. They are good at their job and they can do their job successfully, and they know that's the case because their patients get better. And they do the same, there's some creativity and adaptability, but they do the same set of actions every day, but it's deeply rewarding because you know that you're making a difference. It's that kind of thing. You have to help with corrective maths because it is 30 years old and the design of the programs has improved. You have to help it. You have to give those bookmarked delayed tests that you might have talked to Nifty personnel about, for example, National Institute for Direct Instruction. Anytime students make mistakes, we go back to it later. You have to do that a lot with corrective maths, especially with operations, especially column multiplication, because the more complex it gets, the harder the kids find it. And that can be a trial, doing so much repeating, going even above and beyond the repetition the program does. But mastery is the key. Make sure students know it like their names. They find it effortless to do this. Get them to that point, and then the learning becomes easier and it becomes more reinforcing. So it's the deep satisfaction of someone who knows how to do a job and can do it successfully and can change students' lives. It's not what you would find perhaps in a movie about what a teacher can do to inspire students. Be inspirational, be happy, be friendly, be full of humanity, but also use the tools that are going to make the students successful. You mentioned replacing the teacher with a robot. Some people might think that Okay, well, if this is all just a script, you're reducing me to the level of a robot. People have tried to create computerized programs, and those computerized programs can be quite successful with individual students. But at the same time, we have this gigantic industry with all these buildings with millions and millions of people going to them all the time, which is actually really quite well designed to be able to have the potential to make students successful. And B, kids need adults. They need that you're teaching more than the academic content. You are developing relationships. You are teaching habits of behavior. You are teaching what it means to be a good person in every interaction that you have. And so, no, you can't replace the teacher with a robot. You can't replace them with a video. And actually, I think having a really good scripted model of instruction is just the right balance between being prescriptive, but also having the humanity in there. Ironically, I think direct instruction is the most responsive and adaptive form of teaching there is. And also, somewhat ironically, you can be more yourself teaching it than you would if you were overloaded thinking about how your lesson's going to go, because you can deliver those words in blue and you can correct the students where they go wrong, and then you can be freed up to be yourself.
I love that response. Well, I think we'll end with this. You alluded to some success with using these programs in terms of student outcomes. What sort of success have you experienced?
I see success everywhere I go because of those programs and the fidelity with which they are implemented. With corrective maths in the set of schools I've been working in over the last few years, we have seen numeracy age increases on average of 2.5 years in a year and a half. That's the average. Some students have gone from a numeracy age of 6 to a numeracy age of 13 in that time. I've also been involved with implementing corrective reading, the sister program to corrective maths, and we've seen similar, although over a much shorter time scale. So we've seen 2.5-ish, 3 years of reading age improvement on average in only 4 months of implementation, because reading has a different structure to maths, so you can have dramatically bigger gains in shorter periods of time. We're also doing a implementation of connecting math concepts in our primary schools, and the students are really acing some of their benchmarks there, which is fantastic. We're seeing 20% improvements at least in just 1 year of implementation. So it's successful everywhere you implement it, and it's reliable and it's scalable. Yeah, we've seen some really positive results.
That is absolutely awesome. Well, Jon, it is so great to have you on the podcast for this special episode. I just want to say to everyone who's listening, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'd appreciate it if you gave it a 5 star. Spread this around. You're looking for solutions to some of the persistent problems in schools, and direct instruction is one of, if not the best solutions for many of those problems. We also have coming up, which I'm sure I will say in the introduction, but once again, there is Nifty's big annual conference in Eugene this year. I will be there, so I would love if you would come and check that out, and also just reach out to the National Institute for Direct Instruction and see how they can help with your implementation needs. Jon, thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, Zach.